forward to discussing how companies can transform the lifetime value to CAC ratio through retention. So this session is essentially focused on, talking about customer retention. What does that retention look like, and how can you start to shift a lot of the focus that has traditionally been on, acquiring new users to really kind of understanding and making sure that we're focusing on increasing the lifetime value of the customers that you do have. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. One of the trends that we've seen consistently is that customer acquisition costs have skyrocketed over the past decade. So it's now become 222% more expensive to acquire users than it has become historically. I think there's a new stat that says it's about $6 to acquire every single new customer. So really making sure that once you do acquire those customers through paid social, search, advertising, social media, however your team is investing budget in acquiring those customers, making sure that when you do acquire them, you have a path in place to retain them. One of the trends that we've also seen is that when a new user downloads the mobile app, only about 10% of those customers are coming back after 10 days. So on day 0, all of the customers are super engaged. They're super excited. They've downloaded your app for the first time. But on day 1, we already start to see a really steep drop off. So only 20% of customers on average are coming back on day 1 to your mobile app. And by day 10, it's already reduced down even further to about 10%. So this can sort of indicate that a lot of more forward-thinking companies are starting to think about how they're focusing and shifting the focus to retention to bring customers back to the mobile app versus just continuing to acquire new customers to hopefully try to increase that 10% rate. So we took this a bit further and actually wanted to look at a verticalized level to understand where there are certain verticals where maybe retention was indicatively higher, or are there certain verticals that maybe have a little bit of room for improvement. So in general, news and media on a 30-day scale, about 11 to 12% of those users are coming back. This makes a lot of sense. There's so much going on in the world today. Users are maybe more highly engaged in news. Maybe they're being prompted a little bit more frequently to come back to those mobile experiences. But it seems like in other areas, potentially like finance or food and delivery or travel, I almost would have expected these rates to be a little bit higher. So this was a little bit interesting just in that a lot of companies are not seeing the same retention rate. That 10-day retention rate is the 10-day retention rate that we saw of 10% is shrinking even further. So, we're seeing a 3, 4, 5% retention rate by day 30. So one of the things that we're really focusing on is that by increasing user engagement and retention, businesses are able to increase the amount of revenue that each user is generating over the lifetime. This can lead to more predictable revenue and overall greater revenue from this user. So essentially this is saying is that, in those first couple of days, if you are able to improve the retention and if you are able to get more users back to the app on a daily basis, the chances are that that user is going to end up spending more money on your app. Makes a lot of sense, but this can also lead to more predictable revenue. So if you know that you're able to increase that retention rate by a couple of percentage points, understanding a little bit more about what that does to your long-term bottom line. So increasing customer retention rates by 5% has been shown to increase overall profits by 25 to 95%. So even the slightest bump in that retention rate can really have a meaningful impact on what it's doing to your long-term profits. And later in the talk, we'll get into some case studies that actually walks through a couple of examples of how customers were able to do this live and show significant improvements in profit through an increase in that retention. So when we start to think about ways to calculate the LTV of your customer, there's a couple of ways that you can think about this. So you can look at if you have maybe a more advertising-focused business, you're trying to drive as many users in for as long as possible, have them have multiple sessions. You can think about it in terms of the monthly revenue per customer times the customer lifetime in months. So how long is this customer staying with you? How long is this customer a loyal customer? Or you could look at the average monthly revenue per customer divided by the total churn. So this starts to pull in the churn ratio, how many customers are churning versus how many customers are actually spending revenue in your app. And like many of you, if you have a business where a lot of it is driven digitally, or there's maybe like in-app purchases or subscriptions, you would calculate the LTV by looking at the average order value times the number of repeat sales times the average retention rate in months. So this is essentially saying if a customer, maybe pays $9.99 for a subscription and they come back for 12 months, what does the lifetime value of that customer ultimately look like? The reason that this is really important is because what we've seen is that apps with greater LTV tend to have a longer lifespan in the App Store. So this is, of course, due to multiple factors. It could just be a higher quality app in general, but it also means that you have more things to bring users back to engage them with. Apps with a greater LTV are more likely to reach the top charts. So if you start to analyze the top 10% of mobile apps in a given category, those apps are more likely to have higher retention rates overall. They're more likely to remain popular for longer periods of time. So these apps in general have a longer lifetime, longer longevity. They have more loyal users who are less likely to switch to a competitor. So this is increasingly important. I know everyone in this room is very focused on mobile, and it's such a competitive world. So making sure that when you do acquire those really valuable users, that maintaining that user and building a strong relationship with that user will actually mean that they're less likely to potentially use one of your competitors. This will, of course, help you generate more sustained revenue growth over time. So if this user is now a loyal user, they're more likely to invest with you. They're more likely to make purchases, make multiple purchases, which just makes your apps more successful in the long term. So I know we have a couple of stats in here, but truly increasing the lifetime value by 1% can result in a 10 to 12% increase in revenue. So starting to pay attention to the users that are maybe lower hanging fruit when it comes to bringing them back, even if you can increase that LTV by 1%, this can have meaningful impacts on your revenue ultimately. And so now sort of the question of the day is, how do you do this? We think a lot about the onboarding process of mobile apps and sort of what that looks like across multiple customer engagement touchpoints. So this is an example here of maybe a customer who downloads the mobile app, making sure that they have a really great user experience. You can do this through push messaging, email, in-app messaging, SMS, messaging users across multiple channels to try to bring them back. You can optimize your app onboarding, so there's ways that you can use in-app messaging to actually guide them through a user experience. If you have maybe new products that you've developed and you want to show customers how to actually take advantage of these products or sign up for something in the mobile app. You can also use the onboarding experience to educate users. And you can also use it to implement loyalty and rewards programs. So you can use messaging to drive people to sign up to loyalty programs. You can drive them to complete specific actions in the mobile app. And so we really start to think about this in terms of an omni-channel approach. So the more devices that you have across multiple channels, these are just more touch points that you have to engage your users. But we do like to think about this holistically. So sort of bringing all of these channels together to understand how you're messaging users across push, how you're messaging customers across email, and how that buyer journey really comes together for a unified messaging strategy. We've seen that when this happens during the onboarding experience and when this happens during the retention experience in general, it does lead to overall greater engagement rates long term. And then in one signal, you can see this is just sort of like a seamless UX in which your team can go in and create this journey quite easily and understand the different touch points for our customer. So I know we've discussed a little bit about the onboarding experience, but really thinking about when a user downloads the mobile app on day one, how can you make sure that those users are getting through that onboarding experience in a personalized way? So understanding, maybe where a user dropped off in a sign-up flow, or maybe if they didn't complete specific actions in your mobile app, finding relevant touch points where you can personalize the content to try to incentivize that user to come back and remain a loyal customer for longer, trying to break that barrier of that 10% retention rate. So you can also think about breaking down your onboarding into more bite-sized chunks. So it doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all onboarding experience. You could think about it in terms of maybe where different traffic comes from, if there's a way that you wanted to think about setting up onboarding based on maybe how a user downloaded the app. If you wanted to think about maybe if a customer has made a purchase in the past, or maybe they're a churned customer that has come back, you can start to set up different onboarding flows for different types of customers. And essentially during this onboarding process, you can walk customers through how they can ultimately get the most out of your product. We also think a lot about post-purchase. So for a customer to retain as a loyal user, once they've made that first purchase, they're much more likely to make second and third purchases. And arguably, those are some of your highest value users. So even if it's only 1 or 2% of your entire audience that is making the most amount of, that's helping you make the most amount of revenue, finding ways to engage those users in a really personalized and meaningful way will pay huge dividends long term. So essentially, understanding if this customer maybe had a great experience and wants to leave a review, you can find various touch points, post-purchase. You could also send messages to, help them purchase something that is complementary to something they've purchased in the past. So, maybe they've purchased some sneakers, maybe they're in the market for a hat. You can kind of message people with more personalized approaches this way. And then again, if you do have loyalty or referral programs, it may be better to think about having users opt into loyalty and referral programs after they've made that first purchase and after there's sort of like proof of sale and proof that the customer is, ultimately converted. And then in general, thinking about re-engagement. So I think this is, and in my experience, this is actually one of the areas that's probably most overlooked in retention is sort of that bucket of users where you're saying these people aren't active, they're not coming back to my app, I don't know what to do with them, I'm not getting any revenue with them, how can we sort of fix this? There's a lot that you can do with re-engagement. So I think looking at, again, buckets of users, maybe people who have churned in the past, people who maybe were paying for a subscription, and then stopped paying, how can you maybe incentivize those users to come back with a discount or try the product again or another trial? We've seen that be increasingly effective, especially with mobile kind of subscription products. In general, just offering various incentives. These people are, they have maybe churned a little bit, they're not as engaged. You probably don't want to go too overboard with the promotional messaging. But if there are ways that you can add value in a personalized way, something like that could be, super valuable. But effectively treating these users differently than you treat your main audience. So if you have a main audience of people who are going through an onboarding flow, you probably wouldn't want these users who are maybe a little bit lapsed in that same flow. So thinking about this in a couple of different ways, so you can set up more of an onboarding flow, more of a post-sale flow, and then more of a re-engagement flow, just to start to have different conversations with your customers across various touch points. So boosting engagement and the lifetime value by leveraging user data in real time. On average, user segmentation leads to 21% higher notification click-through rates, and leveraging data-driven personalization and automation boosts this by 50%. So ultimately, this is a stat that we've worked with one of our customers and actually a couple of our customers to develop just to see some of the nuances of maybe what they were doing when they first started out with their messaging strategy. And once they implemented a more data-driven approach, what impact did that actually have on their messaging? And we've seen time and time again, the more that customers or companies are segmenting their audience and personalizing that message, the higher dividend it's going to pay long term in terms of engagement. And so talking through a couple of successful examples here. So Kyivstar is an example of a large telco company. They're actually based in Ukraine. And prior to 2019, they were really, really focused on user acquisition. So they were spending all of their time here just really focused on trying to get as many users to download the app as they possibly could. And in 2020, they really decided to pivot and change their North Star metric to focusing on monthly active users and how many people they could actually get using the mobile app on a monthly basis. And so there were a couple of strategies that they implemented. One of the strategies they implemented was an onboarding campaign to say, okay, if a user has downloaded the mobile app, are we making sure that they're moving through a sign-up flow? Are we making sure that they understand all of the different services that are available in the mobile app? And this was through just a series of messages that were happening in the mobile experience through in-app messaging. One of the campaigns that we worked with their team to run was something called a top-up campaign. So they provide services in the mobile space where you can, purchase minutes or you can purchase data plans. They also have internet plans. So they really wanted to focus on more of these purchases coming from the mobile experience. They essentially had an analytics provider set up where they were trying to understand users who had reached their limits on a monthly basis of their kind of data plans. And we helped them run an engagement plan, an engagement like flow that engaged those users that were in a position to top up. So what we saw is that over an annualized period, we were able to help them generate $3 million in revenue, which is this $7,200,000 US on a monthly basis from this one campaign that we were able to help them run. So just by messaging people and saying, it's time to top up your mobile device, would you like to do this in a personalized way? We were able to help them generate $3 million, which is pretty significant from something that you would think is fairly obvious, just to message people and say it's time to top up. But I think it was a great example of a business that didn't really have a strategy for retaining and for engaging their existing users in place, and we were able to help with that. So I think they were able to see that long term, this really increased the revenue that they've been able to generate by about 10% from the mobile app, which is really significant for a business that is primarily like Wi-Fi and mobile. They have a lot of in-person stores and they have a lot of like online services. So the shift to mobile and the shift to engaging customers across mobile really paid off for them. They also leverage a bunch of A/B testing to really understand like where in the flow users are more likely to convert for a couple of different campaigns. So this was something that was also quite important for them. So another example of this is a gaming company who, again, was really focused on user acquisition. So they were spending a lot of revenue on trying to just acquire as many users as possible, but they weren't really leading them through onboarding or through engagement flows. One of the things that their team found was that actually 2 minutes after someone exited out of the mobile app was actually a prime opportunity to engage them. So you wouldn't really think that this is, or you would maybe think that this is quite aggressive, but through some of the A/B testing, they actually found that as soon as someone exited out of the app, if they were able to send them a message after that, they were actually able to drive them back into play, again, much faster. Of course, this strategy will work for some businesses and might not work for others, but another example is maybe if a user drops off in a certain funnel, you could set up a message to re-engage them a little bit faster than you might be doing today. They also had some unique challenges in that all of their customers are based all over the globe. So they really needed a solution that could scale in terms of localization and time-based sends. I think they have various notifications that are just going out all across the world, and they were essentially looking for a way to do this. They were looking for a way to do this at scale. One of the metrics that they were really able to impact through implementing essentially a journey when users would onboard on day one and sort of come back to the mobile app is they were able to increase the paid user activation by 140% within 10 days of implementing this strategy. So they were able to see really high results relatively quickly by implementing some of these flows. And I think one of the things that really helped with that is that they were segmenting their user base. So they were trying to understand, who are users that are already paying us. I think they call them more like VIP users, but who is that sort of like 1 or 2% of your audience that's helping to generate the most revenue, and how are you messaging them a little bit differently? How are you messaging them differently compared to people who are maybe not yet in a position to make a purchase? They're not interested in making an in-app purchase because they haven't fallen in love with your app yet. Maybe they don't know how to use all of the features and functionalities. So really splitting out the messaging and really segmenting based on sort of where a user is in their mobile experience with you can help to make the messaging when you do send promotional messaging worthwhile, and that it does sort of like drive a higher impact because those people are more likely to make a purchase versus messaging people who maybe aren't in a position to make a purchase just yet. And then the other stat that I have here is through personalizing the messaging, so incorporating more personalized approach. Like you can see here, they had some things that were pulling in. Oh, sorry, I don't think my cursor works. Oh, yeah, it does. You can see things that are a bit more personalized in this message. They saw a 650% increase through personalizing these messages. So we've seen a lot of times that when companies are setting up onboarding flows or they're just trying to get automated messages live in general, it'll be sort of this like one-size-fits-all spray and pray approach. And while that does, work and sometimes garner some like top line results if you're trying to get something live quickly, really iterating on these processes and making sure that you are building out more of a strategy long term and using insights for your business and kind of transferring that into how you're messaging your customers will really pay off long term with some of these more personalized, more segmented approaches. And then lastly, just talking a little bit about Bit, who is a fintech customer. So they were launching their mobile app, and they had a couple of challenges. The first challenge that they were seeing was that their onboarding was not where it needed to be, and they didn't really have the developer resources to improve this onboarding experience. So we started to partner with them and actually helped to create some of these in-app messaging pieces that you see here. Where we can help guide them through the onboarding experience of the app. So they had a relatively long, KYC, know your customer process that's common in fintech apps. You have to sign up for a couple of things and get verified. It can be quite a lengthy process. We were able to help them explain to their new users who had downloaded the app how easy this could be and really guide them through that process. We were also able to help them set up different triggers where users may have dropped off in that onboarding funnel. So they knew that once they could get users through that funnel, they were more likely to add funds into their account. But this funnel was really a big hurdle to make sure that those users kind of set up their account and completed those actions. So we really worked with them to build out a quite personalized onboarding approach. They then kind of evolved the strategy a bit further and wanted to understand how they could use in-app messaging, push, email, and SMS together to hopefully drive more swaps, which is essentially like kind of crypto swaps. They're trying to drive loans and they're just trying to drive purchases and in-app transactions. And so we helped them create a flow in which a user would sort of enter this flow. They would receive a few messages, and then maybe based on the specific action they took, they would either enter a different journey or maybe they would fall out of that journey if they did ultimately kind of create that swap. And I think we were able to assess that they were able to drive an increase in loans taken out by 54% as a result of more timely targeted messaging campaigns. So the team was super happy with this as they were able to just have much more engaging messaging in general that I think spoke much more to this specific audience versus it being more widely available messaging. And then on the technology side, some of the things that we were able to improve is we just improved the app security for those users in general by walking them through the two-factor authentication. So it really helped to kind of up-level and fortify their mobile app. So that's mostly it in terms of our presentation today. I'm talking a little bit about customer acquisition and retention. There are case studies here and QR codes if anyone wants to read a little bit further. But otherwise, we can open it up to questions.
So when you're talking about LTV, if you increase LTV by 1%, you were saying you get a 10 to 12 increase in revenue. Is that because you're able to acquire more users because it makes more media sources viable? Because obviously LTV being the sort of the average revenue per user over their lifetime, how does that increase revenue? What's the mechanism?
Yeah, so essentially the way that we think about it is that if you're able to improve your question was if you're able to improve the lifetime value of your user, how does that impact revenue?
How does it impact revenue more so than the LTV itself? The revenue is increasing by 10 to 12%, but the LTV is only 1%?
Yes. Okay, so essentially, if you're able to increase how long that user is on average spending in your mobile app and the kind of increasing that retention rate that we were seeing, that's essentially what's driving the increase in revenue. So you do need to sort of have a monetization strategy in place that when those users are spending longer in the app, you're monetizing them and finding ways to monetize them. But in general, when that LTV metric is increased by 1%, we've seen that 10% increase. Is that because there's sort of better promoters, they're getting other users on board? Because obviously if you're just talking about, say, 1,000 users, if you're only increasing their LTV, those 1,000 in isolation by 1%, surely the revenue just increases by 1%? Let me double check that for you. I'll double check that for you, but and can give you the information of where we pulled this from.